Welcome to a place where the rain falls softly against the windowpane, and the world outside fades into a distant murmur. In these quiet hours, when the bustle of the day has stilled, we can turn our thoughts to stories woven from shadow and memory, to tales not of triumph, but of profound and haunting truths. Tonight, we drift into the dream-stricken city of Yharnam, not with the clamor of the hunt, but with a slow, contemplative step through its rain-slicked, empty streets. We will listen to the echoes left behind by an institution that promised salvation, but delivered a far more complex inheritance: the healing church. This is a story of faith turned to fanaticism, of miracles born from terrible secrets, and of sins so deeply buried they have become the very foundation upon which the city now sleeps. So find a comfortable rest, close your eyes, and let the sound of the rain carry you into the forgotten corners of this long, dark night. And in this quiet, we can begin at the beginning, not with a bang or a declaration, but with a parting of ways, a schism in a place of learning that would one day birth a cathedral. Picture, if you will, the halls of Byrgenwerth, not as they are now, a silent, dusty relic, but as they were, humming with a fervent, almost desperate, intellectual energy. The air there was thick with the scent of old parchment and the ozone tang of arcane inquiry, a place where scholars peered into the deep, dark waters of the universe and saw things that should not be seen. Among them was a man named Laurence, a scholar of formidable will and vision, whose eyes were fixed not merely on understanding the cosmos, but on harnessing it. He stood before his mentor, Willem, a man whose body had grown still and stone-like, whose only advice was to fear the old blood. But to Laurence, such fear was a cage. He saw not danger in the crimson fluid discovered in the labyrinthine tomb of the gods, but potential, a key. It was a parting not of anger, but of profound philosophical divergence. One man sought insight through silent, patient thought. The other sought to enact his will upon the world through a more tangible, more visceral medium. And so Laurence left, taking with him a vial of that ancient, potent blood, a relic that glimmered with a dark, interior light, feeling warm even through the cold glass, as if it held a slumbering star within its ruby depths. This single act, this quiet severance, was the genesis. The old blood was not merely a substance, it was a text, a scripture written in a language of vitality and corruption, promising to rewrite the very definition of humanity. To Laurence and his early followers, its properties seemed nothing short of divine. In a world rife with pestilence and suffering, where common ailments could carve a life into a hollow, painful shell, this blood was a miracle. A dying man, racked with consumption, his lungs filled with the gravel of disease, could be given a single ministration, and within hours sit up in his bed, color returning to his cheeks, a light of bewildered life rekindled in his eyes. It was a resurrection, a tangible grace, and it formed the bedrock of a new faith. The healing church was born from this wellspring of hope, its name a vow, a covenant with the sick and the desperate. Its early days were spent in humble, if fervent, ministry. They set up sanctuaries in the poorest districts, places where the air was thick with the smell of sickness and despair, and there they offered their sacred transfusion. The ministers, in their stark white garb, moved like angels of mercy through the crowds, their silver implements catching the faint light, each drop of blood a whispered promise of a future without pain. And as their influence grew, so too did their ambition, made manifest in stone and mortar. The grand cathedral began to rise on the highest point of the city, a monument to this new covenant. Its spires clawed at the sky, not with aggression, but with a profound, yearning aspiration. To approach, it was to walk a path of winding, cobbled streets that seemed to guide you inexorably upward, as if on a pilgrimage. The sheer scale of its doors, great arched things of dark, oiled wood and iron, was designed to diminish the individual, to make one feel the overwhelming weight and grandeur of the institution they were entering. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling of incense and cold stone, and the light fell in great, colored shafts from the stained glass windows, depicting not saints or prophets, but abstract forms, swirling patterns that hinted at cosmic truths just beyond mortal comprehension. It was here, in the heart of this seeming benevolence, that the first whispers began, quiet as the scuttling of insects in the walls. The public mission was one of charity, of healing, but in the deepest scriptoriums and the most secluded chambers, behind doors locked with intricate, unique mechanisms, a different purpose was being nurtured. The old blood was not just a cure, it was a tool, a means of elevation. The true, esoteric goal was not to mend broken humanity, but to transcend it, to use the divine blood as a ladder to climb to a higher state of being. A secret so profound and terrible that it had to be hidden behind a facade of altruism. A sin in its gestational phase, not yet born, but already quickening in the dark. This nascent faith, built upon the bedrock of a tangible, liquid miracle, soon codified its beliefs into a system of doctrine, a theology of the sanguine. The central tenet, the unshakable pillar upon which everything else was constructed, was the veneration of the old blood. It was not seen as a simple medicine, nor even as a gift. It was a sacred medium, a holy relic in fluid form, a direct and physical link to a source of divinity that lay beyond the stars. Sermons given in the echoing nave of the grand cathedral would speak of it in hushed, reverent tones, describing it as the residue of godhood, a leftover from a higher order of being that had, through providence or fate, been made available to humanity. To partake of it was to commune with the divine, not in a metaphorical, spiritual sense, but in a literal, cellular one. The very concept of communion was thus imbued with a terrifying duality. For the common Yharnamite, it was a sacrament, a ritual of healing and belonging, a moment of profound connection with the church and its grace. They would line up in the cathedral ward, their arms bared, their faces a mixture of hope and fear, as the minister approached with the ornate, cruel-looking blood ministration tool. The sharp, precise pain of the needle was part of the ritual, a small sacrifice for the immense blessing that followed, a warmth that flooded the veins, a vitality that made the world seem sharper, more vibrant for a time. But for the inner circle of the church, communion meant something else entirely. It was a physical act of ingestion and integration, a process of slowly, methodically replacing one's own mortal essence with something greater, and therefore something other. The theological justifications for this were elaborate, woven from half-understood truths found in the Byrgenwerth archives and the whispers gleaned from the tomb of the gods. They preached that humanity was a flawed, incomplete state, a larval stage. The scourge of the beast, the horrifying transformation that sometimes followed ministration, was not a failure of the blood, but a failure of the individual's will and purity, a heresy that placed the blame not on the substance, but on the sinner. This belief system necessitated a strict, unassailable hierarchy. At the bottom were the lowly ministers, the public face of the church, who disseminated the doctrine and performed the basic ministrations. They were shepherds, tending to their flock, their faith often simple and untroubled by the darker complexities festering above them. Then came the vicars, like Laurence himself, the spiritual and administrative leaders who interpreted the will of the gods and directed the church's grand design. They were the architects of dogma, their words given the weight of divine decree. This entire structure was reinforced by a carefully crafted atmosphere of absolute belief. The hymns sung in the cathedral were not joyous paeans, but slow, mournful, and haunting dirges, their melodies winding like serpents through the incense-heavy air, speaking of transcendence through suffering, of glory waiting in the great beyond. Religious artifacts were not simple crosses, but intricate, often unsettling symbols. The healing church emblem itself, a sword plunged through a swirling, stylized body, spoke volumes of their philosophy. That salvation was a violent, penetrating act, that grace came with a sharp edge. Every aspect of life in the cathedral ward was designed to instill a sense of awe and submission, to make the populace receptive, dependent, and utterly trusting of the institution that held the key to their health, their sanity, and their very souls. The doctrine of the divine blood was a cage of beautiful, gilded bars, and within it, Yharnam slept, dreaming of miracles, unaware that the key had already been thrown away. As the church solidified its power, a new faction began to coalesce within its highest, most secretive echelons, a group that would take the foundational principles of blood ministration and twist them into something far more ambitious and chilling. This was the choir, and they represented the ultimate evolution of the church's intellectual core. If the common ministers were the hands of the faith, and the vicars its beating heart, then the choir was its cold, calculating brain. They were the scholars who had fully internalized Laurence's initial heretical break from Willem, but they carried it to its logical and monstrous conclusion. Healing the sick was a mundane concern, a mere stepping stone. The true purpose of the old blood was not to restore humanity to health, but to shatter its limitations entirely, to achieve ascension and make direct contact with the cosmic entities they called the Great Ones. Their rise marked a fundamental shift in the Church's direction, from a public-facing institution of salvation to a clandestine organization dedicated to a singular, transcendent goal. Their most profound discovery, the cornerstone of their entire operation, was found deep beneath the grand cathedral, in a place known as the Altar of Despair. There, in a cavern that seemed to swallow sound and light, they found her. Ebrietta's daughter of the cosmos. She was a great one, a being of immense and alien power, left behind in the waking world when her kin departed for their own incomprehensible realms. She was not a hostile entity, but a forlorn, weeping creature, her presence a font of immense cosmic knowledge. To the choir, she was not a monster to be feared, but a goddess to be studied, a living library of secrets. They built their most secure facilities around her, communing with her, learning from her, and likely, in their own esoteric way, worshipping her. Her very existence validated their entire belief system. Here was tangible proof of the higher plane they sought to reach, a bridge between the earthly and the celestial, weeping silent, shimmering tears in the dark. Emboldened by this contact, the choir's experiments grew bolder, more reckless, driven by an insatiable hunger for lineage, for a connection to the cosmos that was not just spiritual but biological. They sought to create a being that could act as an intermediary, a celestial emissary, that could bridge the gap between humanity and the Great Ones and facilitate a true communion. The results of these experiments were a mixture of the grotesque and the pitiable. The celestial emissaries themselves are strange, almost childlike creatures with swollen, bulbous heads, drifting through the upper corridors of the choir's laboratories, their minds seemingly tuned to frequencies beyond human comprehension. But the process to create them, and their lesser kin, the celestial children, was a tragedy of the highest order. These small, writhing things, found in the most forsaken corners of the orphanage, are the failed attempts, the children subjected to the choir's arcane sciences, their bodies and minds warped into something utterly alien and broken. They are the silent, suffering testament to the price of this ambition, their very existence a scream of agony frozen into a physical form. The choir themselves became creatures of this rarefied, cold atmosphere. Their attire, elegant and stark white, reminiscent of the ministers but far more refined, was designed to signify their purity and their separation from the common world. They wore golden headpieces that framed their faces like halos, or sometimes enclosed them entirely, as if to shield their burgeoning intellect from the crude stimuli of the mundane. Their tools were not the simple blood vials of the ministers, but arcane devices that channeled the very power of the cosmos, the auger of Ebrietta's, a tentacled manifestation of their patron's power, and the tiny tonitrus, which called down bolts of miniature lightning. They were the architects of the Church's most profound and dangerous ambitions, living their lives in a world of abstract thought and cosmic calculus, so removed from the consequences of their actions that the suffering they caused in the lower wards, the very beastly scourge that was beginning to ravage the city, was to them merely data, a side effect in a grand, glorious equation whose solution was godhood. Yet within the same sprawling, decaying body of the healing church, another heart was beating, one that pulsed with a different, more frantic and brutal rhythm. While the choir pursued ascension through study and subtle, intellectual communion with ebriettas, the school of Mensis embraced a far more direct, more violent path to the same end. They were a rival faction, a schism within the schism, who believed that the choir's methods were too slow, too cautious. They were led by the fanatical, rambling figure of Micolash, a man whose mind had become so unmoored from reality in his pursuit of higher knowledge that he existed in a perpetual state of frantic inquiry, his thoughts a tangled web of obsession. The school of Mensis had no patience for the slow accumulation of knowledge. They sought to tear a hole in the fabric of reality itself, to beckon a great one directly into a realm of their own making, to force a communion through sheer, overwhelming ritualistic power. This ambition culminated in the single most catastrophic event in Yharnam's hidden history, the Mensis ritual. The details of the ritual are shrouded in the madness that followed, but its outlines are horrifyingly clear. The school required a massive, concentrated source of human consciousness and life to power their invocation, a beacon bright and terrible enough to be seen across the dimensions. They found their fuel in the entire, unsuspecting village of Yahargul, the unseen village. In one night, the members of the school of Mensis gathered the populace, every man, woman, and child, and performed a rite of unspeakable sacrifice. The specifics are lost, but the aftermath is etched into the very stones of the place. The villagers did not simply die. Their consciousness was ripped from their bodies, their souls used as kindling for a metaphysical fire. Their physical forms were left behind, petrified, calcified into statues of agony, their faces frozen in silent screams, lining the streets as a permanent, ghastly memorial to the ritual's cost. And in a sense, it worked. The ritual did not fail. It succeeded in beckoning the nightmare, in creating a self-sustaining pocket dimension, the nightmare of Mensis, a realm of shifting architecture and howling, insane intellect, where Micolash now resides as its host, its cage, and its master, endlessly chasing the echoes of the infant Great One, Murgo. But the consequences bled back into the waking world. The ritual tore a wound in reality, and from that wound, something else was born, or perhaps cobbled together from the leftover parts of the sacrifice. The one reborn is an abomination, a pulsating, seething mound of fused corpses and necrotic flesh, summoned into the blood moon-drenched sky above Yahargul. It is not a true great one, but a pathetic, monstrous mockery of one, a stillborn god made from the corpses of the very people whose lives were spent to create its cradle. It stands as the ultimate symbol of the school of Mensis's methodology, a brutal, direct, and ultimately hollow achievement, a thing of immense power that is, at its core, nothing but death and suffering given a blasphemous, temporary shape. The schism between the scholarly, calculating choir and the ritualistic, fanatical school of Mensis was not merely a disagreement over method. It was a fundamental divergence in the understanding of sin. The choir sinned with cold, clinical precision, seeing their victims as necessary sacrifices for data. The school of Mensis sinned with feverish, ecstatic abandon, seeing their victims as the very paint with which they would daub their masterpiece of nightmare. Both paths, however, led to the same precipice, overlooking a city drowning in the blood they had so fervently worshipped. The echoes of these two divergent paths, the cold intellect of the choir and the frenzied ritual of Mensis, did not remain confined to their secret chambers and hidden villages. They seeped out like a slow, insidious poison into the very streets they purported to guide, a toxic inheritance that would fundamentally alter the nature of Yharnam itself. The city, once a place of mundane struggles and simple lives, was becoming a crucible for forces it could not comprehend. Its fate now inextricably linked to the ambitions festering in its highest spires and deepest pits. The common Yharnamite, the blacksmith, the merchant, the child playing in the cobblestone lanes, remained largely unaware of the theological war being waged over their heads. Yet they were the ones who would first taste its bitter fruits. The initial miracles of the healing church, the resurrections from sickbeds, the return of vitality to failing limbs, began to curdle. The old blood, for all its divine potency, was not a stable substance. It was a live wire, a catalyst that did not merely heal, but changed. And the change it wrought was the scourge of the beast. It did not happen all at once. It began subtly, a creeping malaise that was at first mistaken for a new, strange strain of illness. A hunter would return from the woods with a feral light in his eyes, his reactions a little too quick, his temper a little too sharp. A seamstress would find her hands, once so deft with needle and thread, becoming clumsy, the fingers thickening, the nails growing hard and dark. There were reports of animalistic growls echoing from the closed-off workshops of old Yharnam, of figures seen moving through the fog with a loping, unnatural gait. The church, in its public pronouncements, was quick to label this affliction. It was a sickness of the body, yes, but more importantly, it was a sickness of the spirit. It was the result of impurity, of a lack of faith, a failure to properly accept the divine grace of the blood. The beast was not a consequence of the ministration, but a manifestation of the sin that had always lurked within the hearts of men, now drawn out and given form by the very substance that sought to purify it. This was the official doctrine, a brilliant piece of theological judo that placed the blame squarely on the victim, absolving the church of any culpability, and, in fact, reinforcing the populace's dependence upon it. Who else could protect them from the horrors they themselves were becoming? Thus, the hunt was born. It began as a necessity, a grim, bloody form of pest control. The first hunters were not the legendary figures of song and story. They were a pragmatic solution, a militia formed by the church itself, armed with specially crafted weapons and trained in the brutal, efficient art of disposal. They were the city's immune system, a white blood cell response to the infection festering within its veins. Their early work was shrouded in secrecy and shame. Hunts were conducted under the cover of deepest night, the tolling of a great, mournful bell serving as the only warning for citizens to bar their doors and shutter their windows. The sounds that followed were the stuff of nightmares, the guttural roars of the afflicted, the wet, chopping sounds of cleavers and saws biting into flesh, the desperate, final cries of things that were once men and women being put down like rabid dogs. The hunters would move through the streets in small, grim groups, their faces often masked, their identities hidden not just from the beasts, but from their own humanity. They were gravediggers for the still breathing, and the weight of their duty stained their souls long before it stained their garb. It was in this crucible of violence and despair that a singular figure emerged, a man who would transform the hunt from a grim necessity into a sacred, albeit damned, vocation. Yharnam. He was the first hunter, a man whose name would become a whisper of both reverence and terror. Yharnam was not a scholar or a cleric. He was a practical man, a master craftsman of weapons, and as it turned out, of death. He understood the beastly scourge on a visceral, physical level. He knew its movements, its instincts, its weaknesses. He pioneered the hunter's tools, the transforming weapons that were as much works of art as instruments of slaughter. The saw cleaver, with its brutal, efficient tearing motion, was a reflection of his pragmatism. The burial blade, a scythe that seemed to mourn every life it reaped, spoke to a deeper, more poetic understanding of his macabre role. Yharnam established the workshop, initially a physical space connected to the cathedral, a place smelling of oil, old wood, and cold forge fire, where hunters would gather to maintain their arms and receive their directives. He was a father to this new, bloody fraternity, a stern and distant patriarch who taught his children how to kill, but offered little solace for the nightmares that killing inevitably bred. And the nightmares were plentiful. For the hunters, the line between man and beast was not a solid wall, but a thin, fraying membrane. In the heat of the hunt, in the adrenaline-fueled frenzy of combat against creatures of tooth and claw, a hunter had to tap into something primal within themselves. They had to become faster, stronger, more ferocious than the beasts they faced. They had to embrace the very beastly instinct they were sworn to eradicate. This psychological tightrope walk was a central, unspoken tenet of the hunter's life. The rush of the hunt was a potent, addictive thing, the scent of blood thick in the air, the satisfying heft of a weapon finding its mark, the sheer, animal joy of survival. Many hunters walked this line for a time, but others fell. The church, in its relentless pragmatism, even weaponized this fall. They created the powder kegs, a splinter group of hunters and craftsmen who believed that if a little violence was good, then overwhelming, explosive violence was better. Their creations, like the stake driver and the rifle spear, were unstable, dangerous, and gloriously destructive, a testament to a philosophy that was already skirting the edges of madness. The powder kegs were eventually branded heretics, not for their failure, but for their too blatant embrace of the very chaos the church sought to manage. The true depth of the church's hypocrisy, however, is perhaps best exemplified by the fate of old Yharnam. The district became an early, concentrated hotspot for the scourge. Perhaps it was the density of its population, the poverty that made its inhabitants more reliant on the church's ministrations, or simply a cruel twist of fate. The beastly transformation spread through its cramped, winding streets like wildfire. The church's response was not a redoubled effort of healing or understanding, but one of ultimate, horrifying pragmatism. They sealed the district. Great walls were erected, and gates of iron and stone were slammed shut, trapping the afflicted, those who were fully transformed and those merely showing the early signs, inside to die or devour each other. But this was not enough for the healing church, nor for the man who had by then become its most feared and effective instrument. Ludwig, the first official hunter of the church and the leader of the church hunters. Ludwig was a man of profound, if tragically misplaced, faith. He saw the hunt not as a grim duty, but as a holy crusade. To him, every beast slain was a sin purged, a prayer made manifest in blood and steel. He was a knight in a world that had no use for chivalry, and he imbued his hunter call with a sense of divine purpose. They were the sacred guardians, the protectors of the faithful, and their work, however bloody, was sanctified. It was this fanatical conviction that led him to old Yharnam for one final, terrible solution. The church did not merely want to contain the plague there, they wanted to erase it. And so, they unleashed the fire. The details are murky, lost in the ashes, but the result is a permanent scar upon the city. A great conflagration was set, a purifying flame meant to scour the district clean. The skies above Yharnam glowed an angry, hellish orange for nights on end. The air carried the scent of charred wood and, unmistakably, of cooked meat. The screams from within the walls did not last long, but they were heard, a chorus of agony that was, to the church, the sound of a successful purgation. Old Yharnam was rendered a tomb, a district of blackened, skeletal buildings and ash-choked streets, a permanent monument to the price of purity. To this day, it smolders, a faint, acrid smoke still rising from its ruins, and the beasts that still skulk within its copse are not just monsters, but ghosts, haunting the graveyard that their own salvation built. Ludwig himself would eventually learn the ultimate irony of his crusade. The man who dedicated his life to eradicating the beast, who believed his holy blade was an instrument of divine will, would, in the end, succumb to the very scourge he fought. His transformation was not a sudden, violent thing, but a slow, creeping horror. He would have felt it first in his thoughts, the noble ideals beginning to curdle into simple, bestial rage. He would have seen the changes in the mirror, the thickening of the jaw, the coarsening of the hair, the way his own reflection began to look back at him with feral, unfamiliar eyes. The great Ludwig, the hero of the church, was reduced to a shambling, monstrous horror, trapped in the very sewers and channels where he once hunted his prey. His beloved holy moonlight sword lying discarded nearby, its ethereal glow a mocking reminder of the grace he had lost. His story is the story of the healing church in microcosm, a narrative that begins with lofty ideals and unwavering faith, and ends in a bloody, snarling nightmare. A testament to the fact that no one, not even its most devout servant, was immune to the corrupting touch of the blood they so revered. The sins of the fathers were indeed visited upon the children, and the city of Yharnam was the inheritance, a kingdom of ashes and blood, waiting for the long, dark night to finally end. The long, dark night, however, was far from over. It was, in fact, deepening, its shadows stretching and congealing into forms more solid and more terrible than mere absence of light. The purging of old Yharnam was not an end, but a declaration, a line of fire drawn in the sand that the scourge would repeatedly, inevitably, cross. The church's strategy of containment and eradication created a brutal, cyclical rhythm to life in the city, a rhythm dictated by the tolling of the bells. The hunt became a permanent, dreadful fixture, a seasonal culling of a malignancy that could never be fully excised, only temporarily suppressed. The citizens of Yharnam adapted to this ghastly calendar with a grim, weary fatalism. They learned to read the signs. It began with the whispers. The rumors passed in hushed tones in the corner pubs where the lamplight was low and the ale was thin. A missing persons report that was a little too common, a strange, bestial stench wafting from a previously respectable townhouse. The sound of something heavy and clumsy dragging itself through an attic in the dead of night. Then would come the official proclamation, though it was never called that. It was a feeling, a tension that thickened the air, a collective intake of breath held until it ached. The church hunters, Ludwig's men, would become more visible, their polished armor and severe, masked helms a stark contrast to the worn, practical leathers of Jayaman's workshop. They patrolled the main thoroughfares in silent, imposing squads, their presence both a comfort and a threat. They were the bulwark, the shining knights of the Cathedral ward, but their very necessity was a confession of the festering sickness just beyond the next alleyway. Shopkeepers would begin to close their shutters a little earlier. Parents would call their children inside with a new, sharp urgency in their voices. And then, as the last sliver of sun vanished behind the city's impossibly high spires, the great bell would sound. Its tone was not a clarion call, but a deep, sonorous, mournful note that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but through the very cobblestones underfoot, a seismic wave of impending violence. It was a sound that traveled into the bones, a physical sensation of dread. At that signal, the city would perform its nightly ritual of locking itself away. The heavy thud of oak beams sliding into place, the metallic clang of deadbolts, the frantic scraping of furniture barricading doors. These were the city's answering chorus to the bell's single, baleful note. From behind these fortified walls, the citizens would wait, huddled around guttering candles, listening to the symphony of the hunt unfold in the streets they called home. It was a symphony of chaos, a composition in three brutal movements. The first was the hunt itself. The pounding of boots on wet stone, the shouted, terse commands of the hunters, the sharp, percussive reports of firearms. The boom hammer's distinctive thunderous blast, the Gatling gun's staccato roar from the charnel house of old Yharnam, the precise crack of the evelyn. Then came the second movement, the response. The guttural, roaring challenges of the beasts, a sound that was less an animal noise and more the tearing of sanity itself. A vocalization of pure, undiluted rage and pain. It was the splintering of wood as a transformed citizen burst through a door they themselves had locked, the shattering of glass, the wet, heavy impact of bodies colliding with walls and carts. The final movement was the kill. This was the most intimate and most terrible sound, the one that seeped under doors and through keyholes, the sound that fueled the nightmares of the children huddling under their beds. It was the specific, gruesome acoustics of violence. The wet, tearing sound of the whirligig saw's teeth grinding through bone and sinew. The clean, sharp shink of the rakuyo's blades finding their mark. The sickening, squelching thud of the kirk hammer flattening something that had once been a man into a pulp on the cobblestones. Sometimes there would be a lull, a pocket of silence so profound it was more frightening than the noise. And in that silence, you could hear the ragged, panting breaths of the hunters themselves, the soft drip, drip, drip of blood from their weapons, the faint, pitiable whimpers of a beast slowly dying. Its humanity perhaps flickering back for one final, agonizing moment before being extinguished forever. And through it all, the rain would fall. It was the city's only constant, a weeping sky that seemed to mourn the endless, cyclical tragedy playing out below. It washed the streets in the early hours of the morning, turning the spilled blood into pink, diluted rivulets that ran into the gutters, carrying with them the physical evidence of the night's horrors. But it could not wash away the scent. The morning after a hunt, the air of Yharnam was a complex, nauseating perfume. The clean, petrichor smell of rain on stone was there, yes, but underneath it was the coppery tang of blood, the pungent, musky odor of beast, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and beneath even that, the faint, sweet scent of the healing blood itself, a cloying reminder of the very thing that had caused all this suffering. The city would emerge slowly, cautiously, like a creature from a burrow after a storm, to assess the damage. They would find the scars of the hunt etched into their environment. Deep gouges in the cobblestones from powerful claws, splatters of dark, dried blood on walls and windows, the occasional discarded weapon or scrap of a hunter's garb. Life would resume its semblance of normalcy, but it was a brittle, fragile thing, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time until the bell would toll again. This relentless cycle bred a unique and deeply ingrained culture of paranoia and superstition. The Yharnamites, once perhaps a pragmatic and hardy people, now saw the potential for the beast in every shadow, in every stranger's face, even in their own reflections. Suspicion became a survival instinct. A cough that lingered too long, a flash of temper over a spilled drink, a strange dream recounted over breakfast. Any of these could be the first telltale sign of the scourge. This fear was the healing church's most powerful tool of control. It kept the populace docile, dependent, and utterly loyal. To question the church was to question the only force standing between order and a city-wide descent into the bestial chaos of old Yharnam. Their doctrine was a self-perpetuating prophecy. The blood heals you, the blood can transform you, and only we can save you from the transformation we may have caused. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. This atmosphere of dread also gave rise to new, desperate faiths and factions operating in the church's long shadow. The most prominent were the executioners, led by the zealous, single-minded Laurence. If Ludwig's church hunters were the sanctioned, official face of the purge, the executioners were its fanatical, unforgiving heart. They were devoted to the complete and utter annihilation of anything they deemed impure, but their focus narrowed on a specific, hidden threat: the vile bloods of Cainhurst Castle. The schism between the executioners and the vile bloods represents another dark mirror held up to the healing church's own story, a tale of blood, betrayal, and a different, more aristocratic path to corruption. The story goes that a forbidden strain of the old blood, a thing of chilling, corruptive elegance, was taken to the isolated, gothic spires of Cainhurst. There, under the rule of Queen Annalise, it was used not for healing or even for transcendence, but to create a lineage of aristocratic immortals, beings who sustained their eternal, pallid lives by consuming the blood of others. They were vampires in all but name, a court of beautiful, deadly monsters who saw themselves as a refined evolution, a royalty of blood. To the executioners, the vile bloods were the ultimate perversion, a blasphemy so profound it demanded not just death, but absolute eradication. Their crusade against Cainhurst was not a hunt, it was a holy war. Laurence and his men, clad in stark, unadorned armor, stormed the castle, their purpose as sharp and cold as their blades. The battle must have been a scene of surreal horror, a clash of stark, brutal faith against decadent, ancient power in a setting of frozen, gothic grandeur. The executioners were victorious. They slaughtered the vile blood court, and Laurence himself, in an act of ultimate sacrifice, became the eternal warden of the secret of Queen Annalise's immortality, anchoring himself to the material plane as a frozen, vigilant sentinel upon the castle roof, a king of a dead court in a kingdom of ghosts and snow. Yet, like the beastly scourge, the vile blood taint was not fully extinguished. It persisted, a secret, seductive whisper promising power and eternity to those disillusioned with the church's failing miracles. A reminder that the corruption of blood could take many forms, some feral and raging, others cold, patient, and hungering. Beneath the main streets, in the forgotten aqueducts and crumbling catacombs that formed the city's skeletal underbelly, another consequence of the church's actions festered. The Edon Chapel, a small, neglected place of worship dedicated to the formless Great One Edon, became a sanctuary of a different sort. It was a haven for the few who saw through the church's lies, or who were simply too broken and strange to fit into its rigid hierarchy. Its keeper, a gentle, weary man, offered shelter to the oddities and the outcasts, those touched by the nightmare in ways that didn't manifest as simple bestiality. The suspicious beggar, a man whose very presence radiated a dangerous, predatory intelligence. The skeptical Ariana, a woman of the night who carried a bloodline of unique significance. The cynical Adela, a nun whose faith had curdled into something possessive and fearful, all found a tenuous, fragile community within the chapel's damp, echoing hall. It was a place where the strange and the sacred intermingled, where the hymns were quieter and the truths were darker. It was here that one could learn of Edon, the unseen patron of blood, who existed in voice and essence alone, his influence seeping into the world through the very medium the church worshipped. The chapel was a testament to the fact that even in a city dominated by a single, overwhelming institution, other, older powers were still at work, their agendas inscrutable, their methods subtle, their presence felt only in the echoes that resonated in the blood of those who were sensitive enough to listen. And so Yharnam slept on, but its sleep was not restful. It was a fever dream, a collective nightmare from which it could not wake. The city was a palimpsest, a parchment on which layer upon layer of sin, ambition, and horror had been inscribed. The original text, the simple lives of its citizens, was now almost entirely obscured by the sprawling, bloody scripture written by the healing church, the choir, the school of mensis, the hunters, and the executioners. The grandeur of the cathedral ward, with its soaring architecture and solemn hymns, was built upon the charred bones of old Yharnam. The celestial aspirations of the choir, drifting in their ivory tower, were funded by the suffering in the streets below. The nightmare realm of Mensis was constructed from the stolen consciousness of an entire village. Every miracle was shadowed by a monstrous cost, every prayer answered with a curse. The rain continued to fall, a soft, steady percussion on the window panes, a sound that was both a comfort and a reminder of the endless, weeping sky. The long night stretched on, and in the quiet moments between the hunts, in the hush that fell before the next toll of the bell, the city held its breath, waiting for the next chapter of its tragedy to be written, unaware that the author was no longer in control of the story, and that the ink was, and had always been, blood. The blood, that sacred and cursed medium, was not merely a substance to be transfused or a doctrine to be preached. It had become the city's true architect, its silent urban planner, rewriting the very physical and spiritual landscape of Yharnam with every drop administered, with every hunt concluded. The stones of the city seemed to drink it in, the mortar between the cobblestones darkening to a perpetual, damp crimson, as if the streets themselves were veined with the legacy of countless ministrations. The towering, Gothic facades of the buildings, once perhaps a pale, quarried grey, now appeared stained with a patina of age and something else, something organic, as if the city were a living entity slowly exuding a bloody sweat. In the quieter, forgotten courtyards, where the rain collected in shallow pools, the water would often shimmer with an oily, iridescent sheen, a rainbow slick on a surface of reflected, brooding sky, the residue of old blood that no downpour could truly cleanse. This physical permeation was a mirror to a deeper, more insidious saturation. The blood did not simply flow through veins. It flowed through families, through lineages, a dark inheritance passed from parent to child with the church's blessing. A child born in Yharnam was not merely born into a city. It was born into a covenant, its first breath mingling with air thick with the metallic promise and threat of the ministration that would inevitably come. Its first cries were a prelude to the screams of the hunt. Its lullabies were the distant, mournful hymns from the cathedral. This generational bond to the blood created a populace that was, in a very real sense, no longer entirely human. They were a new species in its larval stage, a people defined by their relationship to a divine poison, their bodies and souls preconditioned, waiting for the trigger that would push them toward either a fleeting miracle or a permanent, monstrous transformation. The very concept of home had been redefined. It was no longer a place of safety, but a fortress against the beast within and the beast without, its comforts measured in the sturdiness of its locks and the thickness of its doors. Within this pressurized environment, the healing church's grip, while seemingly absolute, began to show hairline fractures. The relentless cycle of hunt and purgation, the ever-present stench of blood and fire, the growing number of citizens who simply vanished in the night, never to return. These things bred not only fear, but a slow, simmering disillusionment. Whispers, once confined to the most paranoid corners of pubs, began to circulate more openly, carried on the same damp air that held the scent of the scourge. They spoke of the clerics themselves transforming, of high-ranking members of the church being the most horribly afflicted, their beastly forms all the more powerful and grotesque for their former piety. They told of the forbidden research of the choir, of the terrible sounds that sometimes emanated from the upper cathedral ward. Sounds that were not bestial, but something infinitely stranger and more chilling. The high, keening wail of a mind unraveling, or the wet, squelching birth of something that had no right to live. The official doctrine of impurity and sin began to ring hollow to those who had seen a devout neighbor, a model of faith and charity, suddenly contort into a slavering horror. The question, unspoken but hanging in the air like the mist, was a simple, devastating one. If the blood was pure and divine, why did it so consistently produce such profane results? This erosion of faith gave rise to pockets of quiet, desperate resistance, not in the form of armed rebellion, but in subtle acts of cultural and spiritual defiance. Small, hidden shrines began to appear in the most unexpected places. in the recesses of a forgotten alleyway, behind a loose brick in a cellar, deep within the winding, overgrown gardens of the city's estates. These were not shrines to the healing church or its abstract, cosmic gods. They were homelier, more personal. Some were dedicated to simple, mundane objects: a favorite pipe, a child's wooden toy, a locket containing a portrait, talismans against the encroaching madness, reminders of a world that existed before the blood, a world of simple human connections. Others were more ominous little collections of feathers, animal bones, and smooth, dark stones, arranged in patterns that hinted at a much older, earthier folk magic, a belief system that predated the church and its cosmic ambitions, a plea for protection to spirits of the land that the stone and steel of Yharnam had tried and failed to completely bury. The most poignant of these acts of defiance was the cult of the doll. It began, as such things often do, with a single, overlooked detail. In the old hunter's workshop, now abandoned and dust-choked, there remained the plain, porcelain figure that had been Jayaman's constant, silent companion. To the few who knew of its existence, it was a relic of the first hunter's peculiar loneliness. But stories have a way of escaping their confines, and the tale of the doll, of her gentle, unchanging presence in a world of relentless violence, began to circulate among the most broken and hopeless of Yharnam's inhabitants. She became a symbol not of power or salvation, but of quiet endurance. In a city where everything was in flux, where bodies transformed, minds shattered, and faith curdled, the doll was constant. She did not judge, she did not demand, she did not transform. She simply was. Her unchanging porcelain face became an icon of a longed-for stability. Those who had lost everything to the scourge, parents who had seen their children transform, children who had been forced to barricade themselves against their own parents, would sometimes whisper prayers to her, not as a goddess, but as a listener, a silent witness to their grief. They would leave small offerings for her in hidden places. A single, fresh flower, a neatly folded piece of parchment with a name written on it, a small, clean pebble. It was a faith of profound powerlessness, a devotion to the only thing in Yharnam that seemed incapable of causing harm, a testament to a human need for gentleness that even the most horrific of circumstances could not entirely extinguish. Meanwhile, in the highest echelons of the church, the consequences of their ambition were ripening into a harvest of unparalleled strangeness. The choir's communion with ebriettas had opened channels of perception that were never meant for the human mind. Their laboratories in the upper cathedral ward were less rooms and more like pockets of distorted space, where the very air hummed with a palpable psychic pressure. The light there did not behave as light should. It bent and shimmered, casting multiple overlapping shadows that moved with a will of their own. The air was cold, but it was a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the chill of the vacuum between stars, a profound emptiness that sucked the warmth not from the skin, but from the soul. The choir members themselves were becoming living antennae, their minds perpetually tuned to the silent, screaming frequency of the cosmos. They no longer communicated in simple language, but in a complex system of hums, gestures, and shared psychic impressions. A conversation between two high-ranking choir members would be a terrifying thing to witness. A long, silent stare, a slight tilting of the head, a single, sustained note hummed deep in the throat, and then a mutual, slow nod as a volume of incomprehensible data was transferred between them. Their physical forms were also beginning to reflect their inner transformation. Prolonged exposure to the aura of ebrietas and the use of arcane tools like the auger were leaving marks. Some developed a faint, constant tremor in their hands, a vibration that was not a sign of weakness, but of their bodies resonating with energies from a higher plane. Others found their hair turning a premature, stark white, or their eyes developing a strange, opalescent sheen, as if a galaxy of tiny, swirling stars had been captured within their irises. The most affected began to lose their definition, their features seeming to soften and blur at the edges, as if they were slowly dissolving back into the primordial soup of thought and potential from which the great ones themselves had emerged. They were becoming less human and more like living equations, their very existence a proof for a theorem of ascension that was written in a language of flesh and nightmare. It was in this rarefied, decaying atmosphere that the choir made their most daring and most damning attempt to force the hand of evolution. The creation of the celestial emissaries was one path, but it was a path of guidance, of creating a messenger. They sought something more direct, more potent. They sought to use the old blood as a catalyst to trigger a spontaneous, explosive metamorphosis in a human subject, to create a new great one, or at least a being that could serve as a worthy surrogate for one. The subject chosen for this ultimate experiment is lost to history, their identity erased, but the result remains, a permanent stain on the fabric of reality. The experiment was a catastrophic, yet partially successful, failure. The subject did not achieve a stable, elevated form. Instead, their body and soul underwent a violent, uncontrolled expansion, a psychic Big Bang that tore a hole in the world and created the realm known as the Nightmare Frontier. The frontier is a landscape of pure, distilled madness, a place where the laws of physics are merely suggestions, and the geography is a manifestation of a mind in the throes of an unimaginable transformation. The ground is a sickly, phosphorescent green, bubbling with acidic pools and jagged, crystalline growths that hum with alien energy. The sky is a swirling vortex of bruised purples and angry oranges, a perpetual, silent storm that rains not water, but a fine, silver dust that tastes of ozone and despair. The very air is thick with a palpable sense of loss and abandonment, the emotional residue of the choir's failed god. It is a place where the choir's ambition lies exposed, not in the clean, clinical environment of a laboratory, but in the raw, bleeding wound of a broken dimension. The creatures that inhabit it, the scurrying, insectoid labyrinth madmen, the hulking, pathetic nightmare apostles, are not beasts, but the cast-off thoughts and fears of the being that formed this place, given wretched, temporary form. To walk the nightmare frontier is to walk through the copse of a failed dream of godhood, to feel the echo of a scream that was so vast it created its own hell. Back in the waking world, the school of Mensis, though physically decimated by their own ritual, continued to exert a gravitational pull on the city's fate. The nightmare of Mensis, once summoned, was not a closed system. It bled. Its influence seeped back into Yharnam, a slow psychic leakage that further corrupted an already tainted reality. The most sensitive individuals, those with a latent propensity for insight, began to suffer from a new kind of affliction. They would speak of hearing a distant, incessant crying, the wails of the infant Murgo, a sound that originated in a nightmare but echoed in the minds of the awake. They would have visions of the Mensis brain, the loathsome, pulsing thing that hung in the nightmare's core, its many eyes opening and closing in a rhythm that induced vertigo and nausea. This was not the scourge of the beast. It was a scourge of knowledge, a plague of seeing too much. Those afflicted would often be found scribbling frantic, nonsensical equations on the walls of their homes, or simply sitting and staring at a fixed point in space, their eyes wide with a terror that was beyond the capacity of screams. The church had no cure for this. It was a sickness born from their own sibling faction's success, a metaphysical radiation poisoning for which there was no antidote. The city was now besieged on two fronts. From below, by the feral, physical horror of the beastly scourge, and from above, by the silent, sanity-eroding influence of the nightmares it had spawned. The hunters, the city's beleaguered protectors, were caught in the middle, their weapons useless against the creeping dread of insight, their minds increasingly vulnerable to the very phenomena they were sworn to combat. The distinction between the dream and the waking world began to blur, especially for them. A hunter would wake from a fitful sleep, the details of a haunting dream clinging to them like cobwebs, only to see the same spectral, writhing forms in the shadows of their room moments later. The doll in the dream would sometimes seem more real, more substantial than the blood-soaked streets of the waking city. For some, the hunter's dream, with its quiet, melancholic peace, became the true reality, and Yharnam itself became the nightmare from which they longed to wake. This existential dislocation was the final, subtle knife twist of the healing church's legacy. They had not only poisoned the bodies of the Yharnamites and damned their souls, they had shattered the very foundation of their reality. The simple, comforting duality of awake and asleep, of real and unreal, had been dissolved in a crucible of blood and nightmare. The city and its people were now adrift in a sea of shifting truths, where the only constants were the rain, the blood, and the slowly deepening understanding that the horror was not something outside of them, to be hunted and killed, but was the very medium in which they now lived and breathed and had their being. The long night was not just a period of time. It was a state of existence, and Yharnam was its capital, a kingdom of the profoundly and irrevocably lost. The rain, in its ceaseless, gentle percussion, seemed to be the only force capable of washing the world clean, and yet it consistently failed. It could not scrub the dark stains from the cobblestones, nor could it dilute the metallic taste that had settled on the back of every tongue in Yharnam. It was as if the city itself was exuding this taint, a miasma born from the collective, corrupted vitality of its inhabitants, a spiritual effluvia that no amount of water could purge. The very sound of the rain had changed over the years. Where once it might have been a comforting whisper, a lullaby for a sleeping city, it was now a constant, droning reminder of the damp, of the chill, of things festering in the unseen places where the water pooled and stagnated. It was the sound of a world weeping, and its tears were as tainted as the blood that flowed through the city's heart. In the wake of the hunts, a new, fragile economy began to emerge from the desperation, a black market of hope and last resorts. These were not the official, church-sanctioned blood ministers with their sterile robes and silver tools, but shadowy figures who operated in the interstitial spaces of the city, in the rubble of a collapsed bridge, in the damp arch of a sealed-off aqueduct, in the back room of a pub that asked no questions. They traded in things the church had outlawed or forgotten. A hunter, his mind frayed from too many nights in the company of beasts, might seek them out for a peculiar, glowing moss said to quiet the howling in one's dreams. A grieving mother, whose son was showing the early, telltale stiffness in his joints, and a new, unsettling light in his eyes, might barter her last family heirloom for a forbidden poultice of crushed grave flowers and mercury. A folk remedy whispered to slow the transformation. The most valuable and most dangerous commodity was untainted blood. Not the church's sacred, potent old blood, but the simple, red blood of a human who had never undergone ministration. It was said that a transfusion of this pure, unadulterated viti could, for a short time, reverse the early stages of the scourge, granting a few precious days or weeks of clarity, a fleeting return to a self that was being irrevocably lost. To find such a donor was nearly impossible, and the act itself was a profound heresy, a rejection of the church's central tenet. Those who dealt in it did so at the cost of their own souls, their faces hidden behind thick cloth, their transactions conducted in absolute silence, the exchange of blood and coin a sacrament of a new, desperate faith. This underground trade was a symptom of a deeper, more systemic rot within the church's infrastructure. The once unified hierarchy was splintering under the weight of its own secrets. The common ministers, the foot soldiers of faith, were beginning to see things they could not unsee. They were the ones who had to comfort the family of a man who had transformed not in a fit of bestial rage, but while kneeling in prayer in the grand cathedral itself. They were the ones who had to clean up the aftermath of a hunt, mopping the gore from the very altars where they preached salvation. The dissonance between the official doctrine and the visceral reality of their work created a quiet, internal crisis. Some clung to their faith more fiercely, their belief becoming a brittle, fragile shell that could shatter at the slightest pressure. Others began to succumb to a slow, creeping cynicism, performing their duties with a hollow, mechanical efficiency, their eyes vacant, their hymns sung without feeling. A rare few those with a spark of independent thought not yet extinguished by dogma, began to ask dangerous questions. Their inquiries whispered not in rebellion, but in a confused, desperate search for a truth that the Church was no longer providing. It was within this atmosphere of quiet doubt and escalating horror that the Church's most terrifying secret began to peek through the cracks in its facade: the fate of the clergy themselves. The higher one ascended in the Church, the more frequent and profound one's communion with the old blood, and the more devastating the eventual transformation. The lowly minister might develop a tremor or a peculiar, animal-like smell, but a vicar, a man who had spent a lifetime bathing in the essence of the divine, would undergo a change of an entirely different magnitude. Their transformations were not into the simple, feral beasts of the common folk, but into things of immense size and power, creatures that retained a ghastly echo of their former piety and intellect. They became cleric beasts, towering monstrosities of bone and mangled flesh, their forms often grotesquely adorned with the remnants of their ecclesiastical vestments. A tattered white robe, a shattered golden censer tangled in their distended ribs, a prayer book fused to a massive, clawed hand. Their roars were not mere bestial bellows. They were distorted, agonized echoes of the hymns they once led. A sound that carried the full weight of a shattered faith and a betrayed covenant. To see a cleric beast was to witness the ultimate failure of the healing Church's project. To understand that the ladder to heaven was, in fact, a chute into a far more personal and profound hell. The Church's response to this internal corruption was not transparency or atonement, but a further descent into paranoid secrecy and brutal pragmatism. The existence of transformed clerics was the institution's most closely guarded shame. When a high-ranking member began to show the irreversible signs, they were not treated, nor were they given a hunter's mercy. They were quietly disappeared. They would be led deep into the bowels of the cathedral, to the Edon tomb or other forgotten charnel grounds beneath the city, under the pretense of a special, private communion. There they would be left, or worse, sealed away while still conscious, entombed in the very foundations of the edifice they had helped to build, their final, guttural screams absorbed by the cold, uncaring stone. These hidden crypts became the Church's darkest secret, ossuaries of its own sins, where the architects of the nightmare were interred as its first and most powerful victims. The hunter's duty, in its most secretive iteration, was not only to cull the beasts in the streets, but to occasionally be summoned to these silent, subterranean spaces to sanctify a particularly troublesome or powerful clerical transformation, a final, bloody act of sweeping the evidence under the rug, ensuring that the faithful in the cathedral ward above never had to see the monstrous faces of their shepherds. This culture of secrecy bred its own unique form of loneliness, a spiritual isolation that was perhaps the most profound affliction of all. For the hunters, the healers, and even the high-ranking clergy, there was no one to confide in, no one to share the burden of the terrible truths they carried. Every relationship was potentially a liability, every conversation a possible confession. Trust became a luxury no one could afford. A hunter could not tell his wife about the thing that had once been a vicar he respected, now a shambling horror he had to put down in a forgotten tomb. A quiet intellect could not describe to her colleague the chilling, beautiful, and utterly alien thoughts that flooded her mind after a session of communion with ebriettas. They were all prisoners in their own minds, trapped in a labyrinth of secrets, their humanity eroding not from the outside, but from within, consumed by the things they had seen, and the things they had done in the name of a grace that had long since curdled into a curse. The city, for all its crowded streets and towering, multi-family dwellings, had become a place of profound and utter solitude, each person an island in a sea of blood, their inner landscapes as haunted and desolate as the nightmare frontier itself. And through it all, the great ones, the objects of all this desperate yearning and sacrifice, remained largely inscrutable, their motives and nature a mystery that the Church, in its arrogance, believed it could solve. The choir's studies of ebriettas revealed not a benevolent deity, but a being of profound, cosmic sadness, a creature stranded in a reality too small for it, weeping tears that held the secrets of dead stars. Its communication was not in words, but in vast, emotional resonances, waves of loneliness, pulses of ancient grief, and occasionally a flicker of something that might have been a distant, alien pity for the small, frantic creatures who prodded and studied it. Edon, the formless one, was an even more abstract and pervasive presence. He existed in the blood itself, in the very concept of voice and essence. His was the power that made the old blood so potent, the unseen catalyst in every ministration. To commune with Edon was not to see a form or hear a voice, but to feel a presence in the warmth that flooded one's veins, to sense a vast, empty intelligence in the euphoric rush of the blood's power. He was the most successful of the great ones, in a sense, for he was worshipped unawares by every citizen of Yharnam with every transfusion, his influence growing with every drop of blood that was spilled. His nature as the progenitor of the vile bloods and a silent partner in the Church's work a paradox that no one dared to unravel. The pursuit of these beings, the desperate attempt to bridge the gap between the human and the cosmic, had created not a union, but a series of grotesque reflections. The celestial emissaries were a pathetic mimicry of Great One intelligence. The One reborn was a monstrous mockery of Great One form, a thing of corpses given a blasphemous semblance of life. The cleric beasts were a bestial perversion of the spiritual authority the Church sought to embody. Every attempt to reach for the stars had resulted only in a deeper entrenchment in the mire of the mortal, the flesh, and the bloody. The healing Church, in its quest to transcend humanity, had instead created a gallery of horrors that illustrated every possible way humanity could fail, could break, could be unmade. Their grand project was not a ladder to heaven, but a microscope focused on hell, and every citizen of Yharnam was a slide under its lens. their suffering a data point in a failed experiment of godhood. The night wore on, the moon a pale, sickly pupil in the sky's dark eye, its light doing little to illuminate the streets, and instead casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The sound of the hunt had died down again, leaving behind the usual, echoing silence, a quiet that was somehow more menacing than the noise that had preceded it. In the few homes where candles still burned, the flames gutted and danced, their light a fragile, defiant gesture against the overwhelming dark. Behind locked doors, families huddled together, not speaking, simply listening to the rain and the occasional distant drip, drip, drip of water or something else falling from a gutter. They were waiting, as they always did, for the dawn. But the dawn in Yharnam was a relative term. The sun did not bring a true end to the night. It merely exchanged the palpable horrors of the dark for the bleached, exhausted reality of the day. A time for cleaning up, for counting the dead, for pretending that the coming evening would be any different. The long night was not a cycle of day and night, but a single, unending event, a state of being from which there was no waking, only varying degrees of nightmare. And in the highest tower of the grand cathedral, in the deepest pit of the labyrinth, and in the silent, shifting spaces of the dream, the consequences of the healing church's ambition continued to unfold, patient and inexorable as the growth of a crystal, or the spread of a stain, writing the next terrible chapter in a story that had long since slipped from anyone's control. The silence that settled after the hunt was a fragile vessel, easily shattered by memory. In the quiet of their homes, the Yharnamites were not granted peace, but were instead delivered into the custody of their own thoughts. The mind, in such stillness, becomes a treacherous place. It replays the sounds the body wishes to forget, the specific, wet crunch of a transformed neighbor being pinned against a wall, the high, pleading whine that had escaped its jaws, a sound too human for the beast that made it, and the final, sickening silence that followed. These echoes did not fade. They pooled in the quiet corners of the consciousness, seeping into the space between heartbeats, becoming a part of the listener's own blood rhythm. A mother, rocking a child back to sleep, would find the rhythm of her rocking chair synchronizing with the remembered chop 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 of a hunter's axe. A man staring into the dying embers of his fireplace would see, in the pulsating glow, the feral, orange light of a beast's eyes. The hunt was not over when the streets were quiet. It had merely moved indoors, taking root in the psychic soil of every survivor, germinating in the dark. This internalization of violence gave rise to a peculiar, city-wide pathology of sleep, or rather, the terror of it. To close one's eyes was to surrender control, to allow the carefully constructed walls of waking denial to crumble. Dreams in Yharnam were not escapes, they were interrogations. They were the mind's attempt to process the incomprehensible, and in doing so, they often recreated the horrors of the waking world with a surreal, heightened clarity. One did not simply dream of a beast. One dreamed of a beast with the face of a lost loved one, its claws scraping not at the door, but at the inside of one's own skull. The line between the memory of a scream heard from the street and a scream generated from within the dreamscape became impossibly thin. Many took to drastic measures to avoid this descent. They drank cheap, bitter gin not for pleasure, but for the blunt force trauma of unconsciousness it provided, a dreamless void preferable to the curated nightmares of natural sleep. Others practiced a kind of vigilant half-sleep, sitting upright in chairs, their hands gripping the arms, their bodies tense, listening to the sounds of their own homes. The settling of a floorboard, the scuttling of a rat in the walls, and interpreting each one as a precursor to the transformation, either their own or that of a family member sleeping in the next room. The night was not for rest. It was a long, slow battle against the phantoms conjured by a broken world. Within the healing church, this erosion of the psyche was even more pronounced, though it manifested as a chilling, dispassionate dissociation. The highest echelons of the choir, those who communed directly with the cosmic, had long since abandoned the chaotic, emotional landscape of the human dream. Theirs was a sleep of vast, silent geometries and cold, stellar calculations. But for the rank-and-file clergy, the ones who were privy to just enough of the truth to be terrified, but not enough to be enlightened, the nights were a special kind of hell. A young acolyte who had joined the church with a heart full of pious fervor might find himself dreaming of the altar of despair. In the dream, he would not see the majestic, weeping form of Ebrietas, but would instead be surrounded by the failed experiments of the choir, the celestial children, their small, malformed bodies writhing soundlessly, their too large eyes fixed on him with a silent, accusatory knowledge. He would wake with a start, the scent of lunar flowers and ozone clinging to him, a psychic residue from a place he had never physically visited. The doctrine provided no comfort for such visions. It only labeled them as tests of faith, or worse, as signs of a latent impurity. The pressure to remain sane in an insane world, to profess belief in a system that produced such tangible horrors, created a kind of spiritual vertigo. One could see clergymen in the cathedral scriptoriums, their hands trembling slightly as they transcribed ancient texts, their eyes darting towards the shadows, as if expecting them to congeal into something solid and hungry. It was in this environment that the most profound and most overlooked tragedy of the healing church unfolded: the slow death of empathy. To continually witness suffering on such a scale, to be complicit in its causes and charged with its management, required a certain emotional callousing. The ministers, who had once been moved by the plight of the sick, now developed a professional detachment that was indistinguishable from indifference. They saw the lines of desperate citizens not as a collection of individual agonies, but as a logistical problem. The administration of blood became a mechanical process. Find a vein, insert the needle, dispense the sacrament, move to the next. The flicker of hope in a recipient's eyes was no longer a thing of beauty, but a data point confirming the efficacy of the ministration. This numbing was a survival mechanism, a psychic scar tissue that allowed them to function. But it came at a terrible cost. It severed the connection between healer and patient, transforming a covenant of care into a transaction of vital fluids. The very humanity that the Church purported to heal was being systematically drained from its own servants, replaced by the cold, clinical efficiency of the institution. They were healing bodies while their own souls were atrophying, becoming hollow vessels for a doctrine that had long since ceased to care for the individual lives it was meant to save. This atrophy spread through the city's culture like a weed. Simple kindness became a rare and dangerous commodity. To stop and help a stranger who had stumbled in the street was to risk exposure to the scourge, or worse, to invite the suspicion that one was themselves in the early stages of transformation. The once bustous markets became places of terse, hurried exchanges, eyes averted, hands brushing as coins were passed, followed by a furtive wiping of palms on trousers. The community fragmented into isolated family units, each one a fortress whose primary export was suspicion and whose import was fear. The shared experience of the hunt, which could have been a source of solidarity, instead became a source of shame and paranoia. No one wanted to admit how close the beast had come to their own door, for to do so was to invite the question of why it had been drawn there in the first place. The collective psyche of Yharnam became a tapestry, woven with threads of silence, denial, and a deeply buried, seething resentment towards the very institution that held the keys to their survival. And yet life, in its stubborn, blind way, persisted. It found cracks in the stone and bloomed in the most unexpected places. In a sealed-off courtyard, where the ashes from old Yharnam had once fallen like black snow, a determined, thorny vine had pushed its way through the cobbles, producing a single, blood-red flower. Its petals were velvety and impossibly vibrant against the monochrome gray of the surrounding stone, a quiet, defiant monument to a world that existed before the blood, a world of simple, unengineered beauty. Children, in their relentless, uncomprehending resilience, still found ways to play. Their games were dark reflections of their environment, a skipping rhyme about the beastie in the basement, a game of tag where the one who was it was the hunter, and the others had to flee and hide, but they were games nonetheless. The sound of their laughter, when it occasionally pierced the pervasive gloom, was a jarring, almost sacrilegious noise, a reminder of a potential future that was being systematically extinguished. These small, tenacious sparks of normalcy were the city's true miracles, more profound than any blood-borne resurrection, for they represented a will to live that not even the healing church could completely subjugate or corrupt. Beneath it all, in the city's foundational stones, and in the deep, aquiferous layers that predated human settlement, the water continued its slow, indifferent journey. It flowed from the high, wild mountains beyond the city's walls, through the man-made channels and the natural fissures, picking up the mineral taste of the earth before being tainted by the effluvia of the city above. This water was the city's oldest memory, a chronicle written in flow and sediment. It had witnessed the first settlements, the construction of the first bridges, the rise of Byrgenwerth, and now the slow-motion apocalypse of the healing church. It carried the whispers of the city in its currents, the prayers muttered in the Edon chapel, the frantic equations scratched onto asylum walls, the last, guttural breaths of the dying in the tombs beneath the cathedral. It was a fluid archive of the collective nightmare, and it flowed out of the city into the rivers and eventually the sea, dispersing the psychic residue of Yharnam into the wider world. A slow, inexorable contamination of the very planet. A taint on a global scale that began as a single drop of blood in a scholar's vial. The long night was not just Yharnam's. It was a shadow slowly stretching across the face of the world, and the rain that fell everywhere carried within it the faint, metallic promise of a tragedy that was still, patiently, unfolding. The flower in the courtyard, that single, defiant bloom, was a secret known only to a few. Its roots, it was said, had tapped into something deep and uncontaminated, a vein of pure water that had run untouched for centuries, flowing far beneath the tainted soil and the blood-soaked cobbles. It was a theory whispered by those who clung to such symbols, a fragile hope that beneath the layers of sin, something pristine still remained. They would never dare to pluck it, for to do so would be to kill the symbol, to admit that such purity could not survive contact with the world above. So it was left to grow, a quiet, living secret in a city of loud, dying truths, its vibrancy a color so out of place it seemed almost to hurt the eyes, a visual ache for a world lost. This hidden vibrancy stood in stark contrast to the pervasive gray that was slowly leaching the color from everything else. It was not the gray of stone or of age, but a more insidious hue, the gray of exhaustion, of fear held for so long it had become a neutral state. The vibrant paints on the shop signs were fading, not from sun, but from a lack of care, the owners no longer seeing the point in maintaining a cheerful facade. The fabrics of people's clothes were becoming drabber, as if bright colors were an invitation to attention, and attention in Yharnam was a dangerous thing. The very light of the sky filtered through the perpetual, high mist, and the smoke from old Yharnam seemed drained of its gold and blue, casting the city in a perpetual twilight monochrome. This visual dulling was a mirror to the inner landscape of its citizens, a collective draining of hope, of passion, of the very vitality the church promised to restore. They were becoming ghosts in their own lives, their movements slow and deliberate, their voices hushed, their world shrinking to the immediate, tangible threats of the coming night, their horizons bounded by the next locked door, the next barricaded window. In the face of this creeping gray, the healing church's aesthetic stood out all the more starkly, its grandeur now feeling less magnificent and more like a gilded cage or a beautifully painted tomb. The gold leaf on the cathedral's spires, which had once gleamed with a promise of divine favor, now seemed garish and out of touch, a boastful display of wealth and power in a city dying of poverty of spirit. The stark white of the minister's robes, meant to signify purity, now looked like the uniforms of a clinical, uncaring authority, a blinding, antiseptic white that denied the messy, bloody reality of the world outside. The church was not just failing to heal the city. Its very presence was becoming a visual insult, a constant reminder of the dissonance between the lofty ideals preached within its walls and the grisly reality enacted on its doorstep. The grandeur was no longer inspiring, it was accusatory. This growing visual and spiritual dissonance began to manifest in the city's art and architecture in subtle, unsettling ways. It was most evident in the newer constructions, the additions made during the height of the church's power. The Gothic spires, which had once reached for the heavens with a kind of pious aspiration, now seemed to claw at the sky with a desperate, almost frantic energy. The gargoyles, once simple waterspouts shaped into the forms of benign, mythical creatures, began to be replaced with more bestial, tormented figures. Their mouths were frozen in silent snarls, their bodies twisted as if in mid-transformation, their stone eyes wide with a terror that was all too familiar. No public decree mandated this change. It was an unconscious expression, a seepage of the collective anxiety into the work of the stonemasons and sculptors. They were carving the city's nightmare into its very skin, creating a permanent, public record of the fear that everyone felt, but no one dared to name. Walking through the cathedral ward became a tour of this silent hysteria. Every cornice and archway whispering of the beast that was waiting in the blood, in the mind, in the shadow of the next turning. The art inside the homes of the wealthy and the institutions of the church underwent a similar, dark evolution. The traditional, formal portraits of stern-faced ancestors gave way to more abstract, troubled pieces. Paintings featured swirling, chaotic brushstrokes in deep crimson and black, suggesting forms that were neither human nor beast, but something caught agonizingly in between. Tapestries depicted not heroic hunts, but scenes of vague, cosmic dread, towering, indistinct shapes looming over miniature cities, or vast, empty eyes staring out from a field of stars. These were not works meant for public display. They were private confessions, the nightmares of the aristocracy given form in oil and thread. They were created in the dead of night by artists who would never sign their work, patrons who would never admit to commissioning it, a silent dialogue of dread conducted in the language of color and form, a testament to the fact that the scourge respected no class, that the fear had seeped through the thickest walls and the most fortified gates. This cultural shift towards the grotesque and the abstract was perhaps the most telling symptom of the city's illness. A healthy society creates art that celebrates life, that explores its beauty and its complexities. A dying society, or one trapped in a perpetual state of trauma, creates art that mirrors its own disintegration. The art of Yharnam was no longer about representing the world, but about trying to exorcise the horror within it. It was a frantic, clawing attempt to give the formless fear a shape, to pin the nightmare to the wall where it could be seen and perhaps understood. But the nightmare was too vast, too complex, rooted not in a single monster, but in a fundamental corruption of reality itself. The art, therefore, could only ever be a fragment, a single, terrified shriek frozen in time, adding another layer to the city's suffocating atmosphere of unresolved dread. For the hunters, this aesthetic of horror was not something observed in galleries or on gargoyles. It was the texture of their daily existence. Their world was a palette of visceral, immediate colors. The shocking, arterial red of fresh blood, the dull, meaty purple of bruised flesh, the glistening, unhealthy yellow of a beast's feverish eyes, the black of old, dried gore caked in the grooves of their weapons. Theirs was an art of anatomy and kinetics, a brutal ballet performed in the rain-slicked streets. The transformation of their tools was not just a mechanical marvel, it was a choreography of death. The way the saw cleaver extended with a sharp, metallic shink, its serrated teeth eager for flesh. The elegant, mournful arc of the burial blade as it scythed through the air, a whisper of impending death. The tremendous, earth-shaking thud of the kirkhammer as it transformed from a swift sword into a blunt instrument of divine judgment. These were the hunters' mediums, and their masterpiece was survival, a composition written in the negative space of the beasts they left dead in their wake. But this constant immersion in the grotesque exacted its own aesthetic toll on the hunters themselves. Their garb, initially designed for practicality, became a canvas of their experiences. The once pristine leather of a hunter's coat would become stained, first with the external blood of their prey, and then, slowly, with the sweat and oils of their own stressed bodies, the material growing stiff and dark, smelling permanently of blood, gunpowder, and damp. Cuts and tears from claws and teeth were often not repaired with fine stitching, but crudely patched, adding to the ragged, pieced-together look of a veteran. Their masks, meant to filter miasma and conceal identity, became fused with their public persona. To see a hunter without his mask was to see a startling vulnerability, a glimpse of the human face behind the instrument of death. For this reason, many kept them on even in moments of rest, the blank, often bird-like or gas-masked visage becoming their true face, the human one beneath merely the forgotten machinery that operated it. They were living sculptures of violence, their very bodies and attire telling a story of countless nights, countless kills, a walking history of the hunt written in leather, blood, and scars. And in the dream, the one place that should have offered a respite from this relentless horror, the aesthetic was one of profound and melancholy peace, which was, in its own way, another form of torture. The hunter's dream was a place of soft, eternal twilight, the sky a perpetual, deep indigo, dotted with stars that did not twinkle but hung, cold and constant, like nails in the firmament. The grass was a too perfect, velvety green, untouched by frost or fauna, and the flowers, delicate white grave blossoms, gave off a scent that was sweet and cloying, the smell of a memory one cannot quite place. The doll at its center, was the pinnacle of this serene aesthetic. Her porcelain face was flawless, her painted smile gentle and unchanging, her movements slow and graceful as a slow-turning mobile. She was the absolute antithesis of the chaotic, bloody, visceral world of Yharnam. For a hunter, returning here after a night of carnage was a sensory whiplash. The silence was deafening. The cleanliness was unnerving. The doll's placid kindness could feel, at times, like a mockery of the raw, screaming humanity the hunter had just left behind. This dream, this beautiful, peaceful prison, was the greatest reminder of all that had been lost. It was not an escape, but a different kind of cage, one whose bars were made of moonlight and memory, and whose lock was the hunter's own damned purpose. The silence of the dream was a presence in itself, a substance that filled the spaces between the headstones and muffled the distant, eternal chime of the workshop bell. It was a silence that asked nothing and offered less, a vacuum into which the echoes of the waking world would inevitably rush. A hunter, kneeling by the headstone to return to Yharnam, would feel the transition not as a journey, but as a violent shedding of this fragile peace. The clean, floral scent of the dream would be ripped away, replaced in an instant by the wet stone and copper reek of the city. The soft, giving grass underfoot would become the hard, unyielding impact of cobblestones. The gentle, guiding light of the lanterns would be exchanged for the guttering, desperate flames of street lamps. Their light pooled in small, defensive circles against the overwhelming dark. It was a rebirth into a world of pain, a sensation so jarring that many hunters would simply stand for a moment after materializing, their senses reeling, their bodies trembling with the aftershock of the transition. The beautiful, melancholic lie of the dream clinging to them like a shroud they could not remove. This constant shifting between two realities, the serene, static nightmare of the dream and the chaotic, bloody nightmare of the city, fractured the hunter's sense of self. Which world was the true one? The dream, with its undeniable, tactile reality, its doll that could speak and gesture and offer a moment of hollow comfort. Or Yharnam, with its visceral, immediate demands of survival, its blood that was warm and real, its deaths that were final and absolute for everyone but them. The question was not an academic one. It was a splinter driven deep into the mind. A hunter might find themselves in the heat of a desperate battle against a cleric beast on the Great Bridge, the creature's monstrous roars shaking the very air, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, see the scene as if from a great distance, the violence rendered small and insignificant, as if it were a diorama displayed in the quiet hall of the dream. Conversely, in the profound stillness of the workshop, while the doll looked on with her painted, unblinking eyes, a hunter might suddenly, vividly recall the sensation of a beast's talons ripping through their gut. The memory so sharp and physical it would cause them to gasp and clutch at their abdomen, finding only unbroken leather and whole flesh. The boundaries were dissolving. They were becoming citizens of neither world, but permanent exiles in the liminal space between, their identity a fluid thing, poured from the vessel of the dream into the vessel of the hunt and back again. each time losing a little more of what made them solid, what made them them. For the few who possessed the cursed blessing of insight, this dislocation was exponentially worse. Their eyes, having been opened to the cosmic truth, could no longer filter the world through a comforting human lens. The dream was not a refuge. It was a lie rendered transparent. They could see the puppet strings of a greater will, feel the immense, sleeping presence of the moon presence that curated this pocket dimension. Its form a shifting silhouette of pale, bone-like limbs and ethereal rags against the indigo sky. A sight that was hidden from those with less insight. The doll was no longer a comforting, if artificial, companion. She was a golem of porcelain and magic, her movements a perfect, soulless simulation of life, her kindness a pre-programmed response in a system designed to keep them hunting. The little ones, the messengers, were not charming, pitiful creatures, but wizened, grasping things, their constant, silent pleas a manifestation of a deeper, more desperate hunger. With enough insight, the hunter's dream revealed itself not as a sanctuary, but as the most elegant and inescapable trap of all. A gilded cage whose keeper was a slumbering god of the moon, and whose purpose was to ensure the endless cycle of the hunt continued, with the hunter as its immortal, damned engine. This knowledge was a poison that worked slowly, but inexorably. A hunter with high insight would begin to perceive the waking world with the same terrible clarity. The beasts were not just feral monsters. They were pitiable, broken things, their transformations a physical manifestation of a spiritual catastrophe. The hunter could almost feel the ghost of the person they had been, a screaming, trapped consciousness behind the bestial eyes. The church giants, those hulking, blind guardians of the cathedral ward, were not mere brutes, but tragic, mutated clerics. Their immense size a testament to the power of the blood they had consumed, their blindness a mercy that spared them from seeing what they had become. The very architecture of Yharnam seemed to whisper its secrets to them. The swirling patterns on the cathedral floor were not mere decoration, but star charts mapping the descent of the Great Ones. The statues of the Pethumerians, with their elongated limbs and featureless faces, were not artistic fancy, but historical records of a people who had walked this path before and had been consumed by it. This flood of perception was not a gift. It was a torrent that eroded the banks of sanity. To see the world as it truly was, a chaotic, meaningless, and horrifying interplay of cosmic forces, was to be denied the simple, sustaining lies that allow a mind to function. It was to be forever homesick for a world of comforting illusions that no longer existed. The ultimate expression of this fractured reality, the point where the dream and the nightmare bled together completely, was the hunter's nightmare. This was not a dream crafted as a refuge, but a hell forged from sin and memory, a landscape of perpetual, bloody revenge. To be pulled into, it was to be untethered from all anchors of reality. Here, the geography was a grotesque parody of Yharnam's most traumatic locations. The burning, corpse-strewn streets of the nightmare's version of Yharnam were a direct echo of the night old Yharnam was put to the torch, the agony of that event made eternal. The clock tower, where the tragic form of Lady Maria slumbered, was a monument to the guilt of the first hunters. A guilt so profound it had sculpted its own pocket of purgatory. And at the heart of it all, the fishing hamlet, its huts sagging under the weight of a perpetual, storm-lashed gloom, its shore littered with the bloated, fish-like forms of the Kos, parasites' victims. A place that held the original, most deeply buried sin of Byrgenwerth and the early hunters. This was not a place one simply visited. It was a place one was condemned to, a realm where the past was not a memory, but an active, punishing force. To walk these streets was to feel the collective guilt of the healing church as a physical pressure, a weight that made the very air thick and difficult to breathe. The blood here did not merely pool. It flowed in rivers. It fell from the sky in a crimson rain. It coated every surface with a sticky, fresh warmth, as if the nightmare itself was a living, bleeding wound in the cosmos. Within this hell, the hunters found their most twisted reflections. Ludwig, the holy crusader, was here, but not as the man he had been. His transformation in the nightmare was a cosmic mockery of his faith. His body, a monstrous fusion of man and horse, was a thing of utter biological blasphemy. But his mind, shattered and pathetic, still clung to the vestiges of his noble purpose. He would speak, his voice a gurgling, wet distortion of his church hunters, of the honorable Spartan shields. His madness, a heartbreaking testament to the man he had been before the blood and the hunt had unmade him. He was the ultimate symbol of the church's failure, a knight of a dead god, trapped in a hell of his own making, his holy blade now a useless, glowing relic next to his monstrous form. To face him was not to fight a beast. It was to administer a mercy killing to a ghost, to put to rest an ideal that had died long before the man himself. And then there was the orphan of Kos, the final, terrible secret waiting at the nightmare's end. Its very existence was a scream of injustice given form. It was not a beast, nor a great one in the traditional sense, but a being of pure, undiluted trauma, born from the desecration of its mother's corpse. Its wails were the sound of the hamlet's curse, its violent, desperate flailing, the physical manifestation of a pain that could never be soothed. To fight it on that blood-drenched shore under a sickly, greenish sky was to participate in the original sin. The hunter, an inheritor of the healing church's legacy, became the embodiment of the Byrgenwerth scholars who had committed the initial atrocity. The battle was a cyclical reenactment of that violation, a bloody ritual that could only end with the orphan's death, an act that did not bring absolution, but merely deepened the stain, adding another layer of violence to the already saturated ground. Its final, piercing shriek as it died was not a sound of defeat, but of release, a torrent of anguish that had finally been allowed to escape its prison of flesh, echoing across the nightmare, and perhaps into the waking world, a permanent scar on the fabric of existence. Emerging from the hunter's nightmare was not a return, but a deportation back to a world that now seemed flimsy and unreal. The hunter who had faced the orphan, who had walked through the living memory of the church's foundational crimes, could never again see Yharnam as just a city plagued by beasts. It was an echo, a pale shadow of the true, bloody reality that pulsed just beneath the surface of things. The citizens in the streets were not just people. They were the unwitting descendants of a terrible covenant. The church was not just a corrupt institution. It was the current, decaying incarnation of an ancient, recurring sin. The hunt was not a necessary evil. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of violence born from a crime that had never been atoned for. The hunter, armed with this terrible knowledge, became a ghost in their own story, an actor who had read the final, tragic act of the play and was now forced to perform the earlier scenes, their every action feeling hollow, predetermined, and utterly, profoundly futile. The final choice presented in the dream after the long night's work is done is thus not a choice at all, but a selection of damnations. To refuse Jayaman's offer and fight him is to challenge the warden of the dream, to spill the blood of the first hunter in the very refuge he helped to create. It is an act of supreme violence against the last vestige of the old world, a patricide that severs the final tether to the past. His death is a quiet, somber affair, his final words a mixture of gratitude and regret, a release from a duty that had long since become a torture. But this victory is empty, for it only invites a new, more powerful master. The moon presence descends, a thing of terrifying, alien beauty, its intentions inscrutable, its embrace a cold, biological rewriting of the hunter's very being. To be transformed into the new host of the dream is to become the next Jayaman, to trade one's freedom for the power to shape the next cycle, to become the silent, suffering curator of the hunt for eternity. It is a promotion that is the ultimate demotion, an ascension that is the final, absolute surrender of self. The other path to accept Jayaman's mercy is to submit to the dream's primary function, the erasure of a problematic variable. The scythe's kiss is cold, a final, shocking chill that cuts through the warmth of the blood and the fever of the hunt. It is not a painful death, but a gentle, insidious unmaking. The hunter feels the memories of the night, the screams, the blood, the monstrous faces, the cosmic truths, being gently, irrevocably peeled away from their mind like layers of an onion. The sound of the doll's voice saying she will remember them is the last, sweet lie they will ever hear. They wake, or seem to wake, in the morning light of Yharnam, the night over, the hunt concluded. The sun is bright, the air is clean, and the horrors of the previous night are nothing but a fading, troubled dream. But it is the dream that was the reality, and this waking world is the final, most beautiful and most terrible illusion. The hunter is free, but they are free into a world they no longer understand, a world built upon lies they can no longer recall, their mind scrubbed clean of the very truths that would allow them to see the prison they have re-entered. They are a blank slate, ready to be written upon once more by the city's slow, grinding tragedy, their freedom the most exquisite and permanent form of bondage. And so, the long night ends not with a resolution, but with a return to the beginning. The cycle is preserved. The dream persists, waiting for the next hunter to stumble into its gentle, unforgiving embrace. The healing church may lie in ruins, its grand cathedral silent, its secrets moldering in the dark, but its legacy is more potent than ever. It has become the very air Yharnam breathes, the blood in its veins, the nightmare in its sleep. The city and the world it has touched will never be free of the taint, for the taint is not an external force, but an internal condition, a part of the very definition of life that the church has rewritten. The hunt will begin again. The bell will toll. The rain will continue to fall, washing the streets in a futile, eternal gesture, its soft sound a lullaby for a world that can never truly wake, a whispered promise that the darkness is not coming. For the darkness is already here, and it has always been here, waiting patiently in the blood, in the moon, in the quiet spaces between one thought and the next.